The dust billowed around Josephine Armstrong's trembling figure as she ran across the dry plains, her white wedding dress catching on brambles and tearing at the hem. It was 1875 in the Arizona Territory, and she had just made the most daring decision of her 22 years fleeing from the altar, and the man her father had arranged for her to marry. The wealthy cattle baron Harold Wilkes was thrice her age with a temper as mean as a rattlesnake, but her father had only seen the business advantage of joining their families. Josephine had seen something else entirely in Harold's cold eyes, a lifetime of misery. The church bells of Copper Creek tolled frantically behind her as she stumbled forward, her lungs burning with each desperate breath. She could hear distant shouting they had discovered her escape. She had slipped out the back of the church just moments before she was to walk down the aisle, snatching the reticule containing her mother's locket and the small amount of money she had managed to save. Her golden brown hair, once elegantly pinned for her wedding, now fell in wild strands around her face as she looked desperately for somewhere to hide. The open terrain offered little sanctuary, but in the distance, she spotted a small grove of cottonwoods alongside what must be a creek bed. If she could reach it, perhaps she could follow the water to the next town, or at least find shelter until nightfall. The sound of hoofbeats thundered behind her, and Josephine's heart sank. They would catch her before she ever reached those trees. Still, she pushed forward, feet blistering in the dainty satin slippers that were never meant for running across the harsh desert landscape. The hoofbeats grew louder closer, until they were nearly upon her. Josephine refused to look back, refused to see the face of whoever would drag her back to that church and the loveless future that awaited her there. "Whoa there!" A deep voice called out, and the horse slowed beside her. Josephine kept running, even as the rider easily kept pace with her. "Miss, you're heading straight for Rattlesnake Gulch," the voice warned with a hint of amusement. "Unless you're partial to the company of Diamondbacks, you might want to reconsider your direction." Josephine stumbled to a halt, her chest heaving with exertion as she finally looked up at the rider. He wasn't one of Harold's men, nor was he anyone she recognized from town. The stranger sat atop a magnificent chestnut stallion, his face partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He wore simple clothes, a faded blue shirt, dusty denims, and well-worn boots with spurs that caught the sunlight. A gun belt hung from his hips, and his hands, resting easily on the saddle horn, were those of a man accustomed to hard work. "I'm not going back," she declared, her voice stronger than she felt. The stranger tilted his head, taking in her bedraggled wedding dress, tear-streaked face, and the determined set of her jaw. A slow smile spread across his tanned face, revealing a dimple in his left cheek. "Seems to me, madam," he drawled, tipping his hat back to reveal striking blue eyes, "you're not running away at all. You're running toward me." Josephine's eyes narrowed. "I don't even know you, sir." "Noah Callahan, at your service," he replied with a slight bow from the saddle. "And you look like you could use some help, miss." "Armstrong. Josephine Armstrong," she answered hesitantly, then glanced over her shoulder. The dust clouds in the distance told her that her pursuers were still coming. "And yes, I suppose I could use some help, Mr. Callahan." Noah's expression sobered as he followed her gaze to the approaching riders. "Bride on the run, I take it." Josephine nodded, suddenly aware of how ridiculous she must look in her torn wedding gown, standing in the middle of nowhere. "It's a long story." "Most worth telling are," Noah replied, extending his hand. "But we'd best save it for when we're not about to have company." "Can you ride?" "Since I was 6, Josephine answered, taking his calloused hand. With surprising strength, Noah pulled her up behind him on the saddle. "Hold tight, Miss Armstrong. Maverick here can outrun just about anything on 4 legs. Josephine wrapped her arms around Noah's waist, the unfamiliar intimacy making her cheeks flush despite their predicament. "Where are we going?" she asked as Noah turned the horse toward the west, away from both the approaching riders and the town she'd fled. "I've got a small ranch about 10 miles from here," he answered, urging the horse into a canter. "We can figure out your next move once you're safe." As they rode away from her past and into an uncertain future, Josephine couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to Noah's words. Perhaps she had been running toward something all along. The terrain changed as they rode, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. Noah guided Maverick with expert ease, occasionally glancing back to ensure they weren't being followed. Each time their eyes met, Josephine felt a peculiar flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. "You ride well for a woman in a wedding dress," Noah remarked after they had been traveling for nearly an hour. "My mother taught me before she passed," Josephine replied, her voice softer with the memory. "She said a woman should always know how to make her own way in the world." Noah nodded. "Sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Josephine agreed, "though my father seemed to forget her wisdom once she was gone." They fell into silence again, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the creaking of leather the only accompaniment to their journey. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Noah finally slowed Maverick to a walk. "There it is," he said, nodding toward a modest homestead nestled in a protected valley. "Not much to look at, but it's home." The ranch was small but well-maintained, with a sturdy log cabin, a barn, and several corrals. A stream ran alongside the property, lined with cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. It wasn't grand by any means, but to Josephine's eyes, it looked like paradise compared to the gilded cage she had escaped. As they approached, a dog came bounding out to greet them, a black and white border collie with one ear that flopped over while the other stood straight. "That's Bandit," Noah explained as he helped Josephine dismount. Her legs trembled beneath her, stiff from the long ride and the day's ordeal. "He looks fierce, but he's about as dangerous as a newborn kitten." As if to prove Noah's point, Bandit circled them excitedly, tail wagging so hard his entire body wiggled. "He's lovely," Josephine said, cautiously extending her hand for the dog to sniff. Bandit immediately licked her fingers, making her laugh for the first time that day. "Come on inside," Noah said, leading Maverick toward the barn. "You can wash up while I tend to the horse, and then we'll get you something to eat." The inside of the cabin was surprisingly neat and comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a well-worn armchair positioned nearby. A simple wooden table with 2 chairs stood in what served as the kitchen area, and a curtain partially concealed the sleeping area in the back. Everything was clean and orderly, speaking of a man who took pride in his home despite its simplicity. "There's water in the pitcher by the washstand," Noah said, gesturing to a small table with a basin. "I'll bring in more from the well for you to clean up properly. There's some stew left from yesterday I can heat up." Josephine nodded gratefully, suddenly overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Noah paused at the door, his expression thoughtful. "No need for that, Miss Armstrong." "And it's Noah, if you don't mind. Mr. Callahan was my father." After he left, Josephine poured water into the basin and washed the dust from her face and hands, wincing at her reflection in the small mirror hanging above. Her carefully arranged hair had come completely undone, and smudges of dirt marked her cheeks and forehead. The beautiful wedding dress, which had cost her father a small fortune, was torn in several places and stained beyond repair. Looking down at the ruined gown, Josephine felt a wave of panic. She had nothing else to wear, no possessions beyond what she carried in her small reticule, and nowhere to go. The reality of her situation hit her with full force, and she sank onto a nearby chair, fighting back tears. She was still sitting there when Noah returned with a bucket of fresh water and a bundle of cloth under his arm. "I thought you might want something else to wear," he said, setting down the items and keeping a respectful distance. "These belong to my sister. She stayed with me for a while last year before she married and moved to California. They might be a bit big, but they'll be more comfortable than that dress, I reckon." Josephine accepted the simple calico dress and undergarments with trembling hands. "Your sister won't mind." Noah's lips quirked into a half-smile. "Sarah would be the first to offer if she were here. She's got a soft spot for folks in trouble." He pointed to the curtained-off area. "You can change back there. I'll wait outside until you're decent." True to his word, Noah left her alone, and Josephine quickly shed the wedding dress, relief washing over her as she stepped out of the constraining garment. The dress Noah provided was simple but clean, a pale blue calico with a modest neckline and full skirt. As he had predicted, it was slightly too large, but Josephine managed to make it work, tying the sash tightly around her waist. She used the fresh water to wash more thoroughly, removing the last traces of her aborted wedding day. After combing her fingers through her tangled hair, she managed to braid it loosely over one shoulder. When she finally emerged from behind the curtain, she felt more like herself than she had in weeks. Noah had returned and was stirring a pot that hung over the fire. He glanced up as she approached, and something flickered in his eyes that made Josephine's pulse quicken. "Feel better?" he asked, turning his attention back to the stew. "Much," Josephine replied, smoothing her hands over the borrowed dress. "Thank you for the clothes and for everything." Noah nodded, motioning for her to sit at the table. "Hungry, starving," she admitted. "I was too nervous to eat this morning." As Noah served the stew in simple earthenware bowls, Josephine realized she knew nothing about this man who had come to her rescue. He could be dangerous for all she knew, yet something about his quiet demeanor put her at ease. "How long have you lived here?" she asked as he sat across from her. "Going on 5 years now," Noah replied, breaking off a piece of cornbread and passing the plate to her. "Bought this place after working cattle drives for the better part of a decade. Saved every penny until I could afford my own spread." "It's lovely," Josephine said sincerely. "Peaceful." Noah's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Most days. Though I imagine it's quite different from what you're used to, Miss Armstrong." "Josephine, please," she insisted. "And you might be surprised. My father's ranch is larger, certainly, but—" She hesitated, unsure how to explain that the grandeur of her father's home had become more of a prison than a sanctuary. "But it wasn't home," Noah suggested quietly. Josephine looked up, startled by his perception. "No, not for a long time." They ate in companionable silence for a few moments before Noah spoke again. "So, who was he? The man you left at the altar?" Josephine set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly diminished. "Harold Wilkes. He owns the largest cattle operation in the territory. My father arranged the match, thought joining our families would secure our future." She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "Harold is 49 years old and has buried 2 wives already." Noah's expression darkened. "Wilkes has a reputation, none of it good. You know him." "Worked for him briefly when I first came to the territory," Noah said, his jaw tightening. "Saw how he treated his men, his horses, everything he considered his property." He met Josephine's gaze directly. "He's not a man who takes kindly to losing what he believes belongs to him." A chill ran down Josephine's spine. "He'll come looking for me." "Yes," Noah agreed, not sugarcoating the truth. The question is, what do you want to do about it? Josephine stared into her bowl, considering her limited options. I have an aunt in Denver. She wrote to me last year, offering me a place with her if I ever needed it. She looked up at Noah, a new determination in her eyes. I need to get to the train station in Tucson. Noah nodded slowly. That's a 4-day ride from here if the weather holds. He studied her face. You're sure that's what you want? I don't see that I have much choice, Josephine replied. I can't go back and I can't. She gestured helplessly at their surroundings. I can't impose on your kindness indefinitely. You wouldn't be imposing, Noah said quietly, then cleared his throat. But Tucson is probably your best option. We can leave at first light tomorrow. Tonight, you should rest. After they finished eating, Noah insisted Josephine take his bed while he would sleep on a bedroll near the fire. Despite her protests, he was firm, and Josephine was too exhausted to argue for long. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the night sounds filtering through the cabin walls, she wondered at the strange turn her life had taken in just one day. She had awakened that morning prepared to resign herself to a future not of her choosing, and now she was lying in a stranger's bed, planning an escape to a city she had never seen. And yet, despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, Josephine felt freer than she had in years. With that thought, she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. The rooster's crow woke Josephine just as dawn was breaking. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing her sleep-addled mind. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and she sat up quickly, pushing aside the warm quilt. Noah was already awake, stoking the fire and preparing what smelled like coffee. He glanced up as she emerged from behind the curtain, offering a small smile. "Morning," he said, pouring the dark liquid into a tin cup. "Sleep well, better than I expected," Josephine admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. The warmth of the cup seeped into her hands, comforting in the cool morning air. "You didn't have to give up your bed." Noah shrugged, turning his attention to the skillet where eggs were frying. "Wouldn't have been proper otherwise." As they ate breakfast, Noah outlined his plan. They would ride for Tucson, taking a route that avoided the main roads where Harold's men might be looking for her. It would add a day to their journey, but the additional safety was worth the delay. "I need to prepare a few things before we leave," Noah said as he cleared away the breakfast dishes. "Feel free to look around the place if you'd like." Josephine stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air. The ranch looked even more appealing in the clear light of day. A small garden plot sat to one side of the cabin, with neat rows of vegetables showing the first green shoots of spring. The stream burbled cheerfully as it wound its way past the property, and in the distance, Josephine could see a small herd of cattle grazing peacefully. It was a modest spread, nothing like the vast operation her father ran, but there was something deeply satisfying about its self-sufficiency. A man could make a good life here, she thought, if he was willing to work hard and live simply. She was still admiring the view when Noah emerged from the barn leading Maverick, and another horse, a dappled gray mare with intelligent eyes. "This is Pepper," Noah said, patting the mare's neck. "She's gentle but sure-footed. She'll carry you to Tucson without complaint." Josephine approached the horse cautiously, allowing the mare to sniff her hand before stroking her velvety nose. "She's beautiful." "And she knows it," Noah replied with a chuckle. "Vainest horse I've ever owned." They set off shortly after, with Josephine riding astride like a man rather than side saddle, as she had been taught was proper for a lady. The practical necessity outweighed any concern for propriety, especially given the circumstances. Noah had packed provisions in saddlebags, enough food and water to see them through to Tucson. along with a bedroll for each of them, and a rifle in a scabbard attached to his saddle. They rode in companionable silence for much of the morning, winding their way through terrain that grew increasingly rugged as they left the valley behind. Noah seemed to know the land intimately, choosing paths that weren't immediately obvious but proved to be the easiest routes for the horses. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Josephine found herself studying her companion. Noah Callahan was not what anyone would call a handsome man in the conventional sense. His features were too rugged, his skin too weathered by the sun and wind. But there was something compelling about his face, a quiet strength in the set of his jaw and a kindness in his eyes that drew her gaze again and again. "Something on your mind, Josephine?" Noah asked without turning around, somehow sensing her scrutiny. Caught, Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I was just wondering how you came to be riding near the church yesterday. It seems a remarkable coincidence." Noah was silent for a moment, guiding Maverick around a particularly large boulder before answering. "I was on my way back from delivering a calf to the widow Jenkins. Her milk cow had a rough time of it, and she sent for me since I have some experience with difficult births." He glanced back at her. "I took a shortcut past the church, heard the commotion, and saw you running like the devil himself was after you. And you decided to help a complete stranger." Josephine pressed, still puzzled by his willingness to get involved. Noah's shoulders rose and fell in a shrug. "Out here, folks help each other. It's how we survive." He paused, then added more quietly, "Besides, any woman willing to run away from her own wedding must have a good reason." They stopped to rest the horses and eat a simple lunch of jerky and hardtack by a small spring. As they sat in the shade of a gnarled juniper tree, Josephine found herself telling Noah more about her life, how her mother's death had changed her father, turning him bitter and focused solely on expanding his ranch and his influence. How he had begun to see Josephine not as a daughter but as an asset to be leveraged through marriage. "I tried to reason with him," she said, absently pulling apart a piece of jerky. "Told him I couldn't marry a man I didn't love, especially not one with Harold's reputation, but he wouldn't listen. Said I was being foolish and romantic, that marriage wasn't about love but about security and position." Noah listened without interrupting, his blue eyes thoughtful. "And what do you think marriage should be about?" he asked when she fell silent. Josephine looked up, surprised by the question. "Respect," she said after a moment's consideration. "Companionship, working together toward a common future." She smiled slightly. "And yes, love too. Perhaps that is foolish." "Not foolish," Noah disagreed. "Rare, maybe, but not foolish." As they continued their journey through the afternoon, the conversation flowed more easily between them. Noah told her about growing up in Texas, losing his parents to a fever when he was 17, and setting out on his own with nothing but a horse and the clothes on his back. He spoke of the years he spent working cattle drives, the characters he'd met along the way, and how he'd finally saved enough to buy his small ranch. "It's not much compared to some spreads," he admitted, "but it's mine, free and clear. No debts, no one to answer to but myself." "It's more than most people ever have," Josephine observed. "True independence." By the time they made camp for the night in a sheltered arroyo, Josephine felt as though she had known Noah Callahan for years rather than a single day. There was an ease between them that she had never experienced with anyone else, man or woman. Noah built a small fire, keeping it low to avoid attracting attention, while Josephine laid out the bedrolls on opposite sides of the flames. They ate a simple supper of beans and more hardtack, washing it down with coffee that Noah brewed in a small pot. "You should get some sleep," Noah said as they finished eating. "I'll take first watch, wake you in a few hours." Josephine frowned. "You think we're being followed?" Better to be cautious, Noah replied, his expression serious. Harold Wilkes isn't a man to let something or someone he considers his property slip away easily. The reminder of the danger they potentially faced sobered Josephine. I'm sorry to have brought this trouble to your door, Noah. You didn't bring anything, he countered firmly. I offered my help freely, knowing full well who you were running from. He met her gaze across the fire, the flames reflecting in his blue eyes. I don't regret it. Something passed between them in that moment, something unspoken but powerful enough to make Josephine's breath catch in her throat. Before she could identify the feeling, Noah looked away, reaching for his rifle. Get some rest, he repeated, his voice rougher than before. We've got a long ride ahead tomorrow. Josephine nodded and retreated to her bedroll, pulling the blanket up against the night's chill. As she drifted toward sleep, she found herself wondering what life might have been like if she had met someone like Noah Callahan before her father had arranged her marriage to Harold Wilkes. Someone honest and hardworking, who valued independence and treated her as an equal rather than a possession. Such thoughts were dangerous, she knew. Noah was helping her reach safety, nothing more. Once they reached Tucson, they would part ways and she would begin her new life in Denver, far from both Harold Wilkes and the quiet cowboy who had come to her aid. Still, as sleep claimed her, Josephine's dreams were filled with blue eyes and a slow smile that revealed a dimple in a sun-browned cheek. The next 2 days passed in much the same manner, with long hours in the saddle broken by brief rests to water the horses and eat quick meals. They avoided settlements and kept to the less traveled paths, though this meant traversing more difficult terrain. Josephine, despite growing up on a ranch, found muscles she didn't know she had protesting the extended time on horseback. Noah noticed her discomfort but never suggested slowing their pace. Instead, he distracted her with stories and pointed out landmarks, teaching her to read the land as they passed through it. He showed her how to identify which tracks belonged to which animals, how to tell how recently they had passed, and how to spot water sources that weren't immediately obvious. You'd have made a fine scout, he remarked as Josephine correctly identified a set of tracks as belonging to a Javelina family. I always wanted to learn more about the land, she admitted, but my father thought such knowledge wasn't suitable for a lady. After my mother died, he became determined that I should be educated in more refined pursuits: music, literature, proper etiquette for a rancher's daughter who might one day marry into society. Noah's expression darkened briefly. Your father and mine would have disagreed on a great many things, I suspect. He nudged Maverick forward. My pa believed that knowledge kept you alive out here, and it didn't matter if you were male or female. He taught my sister to shoot, hunt, and track same as he taught me. He sounds like a wise man, Josephine said. He was, Noah agreed, a note of sadness in his voice. Would have liked you, I think. The compliment warmed Josephine more than it should have, and she ducked her head to hide her pleased smile. On the evening of the third day, as they made camp in a small canyon, Noah grew unusually quiet. He performed the now familiar tasks of setting up camp and preparing their meager supper with the same efficiency as always, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Is something wrong? Josephine finally asked as they sat by the fire, the remnants of their meal forgotten. Noah looked up, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. We should reach Tucson by mid-afternoon tomorrow. Oh. Josephine felt a strange hollowness in her chest at the reminder that their journey was nearly over. That's good news, Noah nodded, poking at the fire with a stick. The northbound train leaves at dawn the day after tomorrow. You'll need to get a ticket as soon as we arrive and find somewhere safe to stay for the night. Do you know of such a place? Josephine asked, realizing how little she knew about the city they were heading toward. "There's a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Flores," Noah replied. "Respectable place, clean. She doesn't ask too many questions if you pay in advance." The practical discussion of the arrangements should have reassured Josephine, but instead it only emphasized the temporary nature of their companionship. Soon, Noah would return to his ranch, and she would be on her way to Denver, their paths diverging like two streams that had briefly flowed together. "Noah," she began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say, only knowing that she needed to say something before their time together ended. He looked up, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight, and whatever words Josephine had been about to speak died in her throat. "We should get some sleep," Noah said, breaking the moment. "Tomorrow will be a long day." As had become their routine, they took turns keeping watch through the night. When it was Josephine's turn, she sat wrapped in a blanket, rifle across her lap as Noah had shown her, listening to the night sounds and watching the stars wheel overhead. Occasionally, she would glance at Noah's sleeping form, his features relaxed in slumber, and feel an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with physical discomfort. Morning came too quickly, the eastern sky lightening with the promise of another scorching day. They broke camp efficiently, having established a rhythm over the past days, and set off toward Tucson just as the sun crested the horizon. As they rode, Josephine found herself committing every detail to memory, the way Noah sat so easily in the saddle, the sound of his low voice as he pointed out a hawk circling overhead, the gentle guidance he offered when the terrain became difficult. These were memories she would carry with her to Denver and beyond, souvenirs of the strangest and most liberating days of her life. They stopped less frequently than on previous days, both of them seemingly eager to reach their destination, yet simultaneously reluctant for the journey to end. The sun was high overhead when they crested a rise and Noah reined Maverick to a halt. "There it is," he said, nodding toward the sprawl of buildings in the distance. "Tucson." Josephine stared at the town, larger than she had imagined, with adobe buildings glowing golden in the sunlight and the spire of a church rising above the surrounding structures. After days in the wilderness, the sight of civilization was both welcome and somehow disappointing. "It's bigger than I expected," she remarked, nudging Pepper forward to stand alongside Maverick. "It's growing fast," Noah agreed. "Railroads brought in all sorts: merchants, settlers, fortune hunters." His mouth quirked in a half-smile. "And the usual complement of saloons and brothels that follow such progress." Josephine felt her cheeks warm at his blunt speech, though after days on the trail together, such directness shouldn't have embarrassed her. They approached the town at a steady pace, the horses seeming to sense the end of their journey and moving with renewed energy. As they drew closer, the sounds and smells of the settlement reached them: the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of children playing, the mixed aromas of cooking food and livestock. Noah led them down side streets rather than the main thoroughfare, avoiding the busiest areas of town. Josephine was grateful for his caution in her borrowed dress, dusty from the trail. She might not be immediately recognizable as the runaway bride of Harold Wilkes, but there was no sense in taking unnecessary risks. They finally stopped outside a modest two-story building set back from the street, with a small garden in front and curtained windows that spoke of relative comfort within. "Mrs. Flores's boarding house," Noah explained, dismounting and coming around to help Josephine down from Pepper. The simple contact of his hands at her waist sent a jolt through Josephine that had nothing to do with the relief of being on solid ground again. For a moment, they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body after hours in the saddle. Then Noah stepped back, clearing his throat. "Wait here. I'll see if she has a room available." While Noah went inside, Josephine stroked Pepper's neck, murmuring soft words of gratitude to the mare who had carried her so faithfully. The thought of parting from both horses and their owner created a tightness in her throat that was difficult to swallow past. Noah returned a few minutes later, followed by a plump, dark-haired woman with a kind face and shrewd eyes. "Josephine, this is Mrs. Flores," Noah introduced them. "She has a room for you, and she's agreed to help you get settled." Mrs. Flores smiled warmly, though her gaze was assessing as it took in Josephine's borrowed dress and travel-worn appearance. "Any friend of Noah's is welcome here," she said, her accent lilting. "Come inside, dear. You must be exhausted from your journey." Josephine turned to Noah, suddenly reluctant to leave his side. "What about the horses?" "I'll see to them," he assured her. "Get settled, rest a bit. I'll come back later and we can go to the train station to arrange your ticket." There was so much Josephine wanted to say, but with Mrs. Flores watching curiously, she simply nodded. "Thank you, Noah." His expression softened briefly. "It's nothing, Josephine." But it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. 4 days ago, she had been about to resign herself to a life of misery as Harold Wilkes's wife. Now, because of Noah Callahan's intervention and assistance, she was on the verge of a new beginning, uncertain perhaps, but free to shape according to her own desires. Mrs. Flores showed Josephine to a small but clean room on the second floor, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the garden. "Bathrooms at the end of the hall," the older woman explained. "Dinner's at 6, but I can bring you up a tray if you're too tired to come down." "Thank you," Josephine replied, overwhelmed by the sudden return to civilization after days in the wilderness. "This is lovely." Mrs. Flores paused at the door, her dark eyes kind but perceptive. "Noah's a good man," she said unexpectedly. "One of the best I know." Josephine blinked, startled by the comment. "Yes, he's been very kind." The older woman's lips curved in a knowing smile. "Kind, yes, but there's more to it than kindness, I think." Before Josephine could respond, Mrs. Flores continued briskly. "I'll bring up some hot water so you can wash properly. Rest now." Left alone, Josephine sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly aware of every ache in her body from the long days of riding. Yet despite her physical discomfort, her mind was clearer than it had been in months. The desperate flight from her wedding had been a leap into the unknown, but somehow, against all odds, she had landed on her feet, or rather, Noah had caught her before she fell. The thought of him brought a warmth to her chest that had nothing to do with the dusty sunlight streaming through the window. In just a few days, he had shown her more consideration and respect than Harold Wilkes had in all the months of their engagement. Noah had treated her as an equal, capable of making her own decisions and finding her own way. And tomorrow, she would board a train that would take her hundreds of miles away from him. The realization sat like a stone in her stomach, heavy and uncomfortable. It made no sense. She barely knew the man, and their paths had crossed purely by chance. Yet the thought of never seeing him again filled her with a sadness that was both unexpected and profound. Mrs. Flores returned with hot water and a piece of soap that smelled of lavender, providing a welcome distraction from Josephine's troubling thoughts. After washing away the dust of the trail and changing into a clean nightgown that Mrs. Flores had loaned her, Josephine lay down on the bed, intending only to rest her eyes for a moment. She woke to a gentle knock at her door and sat up, disoriented to find the room bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. She had slept for hours. "Josephine," Noah's voice came through the door. "Are you awake?" Just a moment, she called, scrambling to make herself presentable. She splashed water on her face to clear the fog of sleep, hastily braided her hair, and pulled on the blue calico dress, now somewhat wrinkled from being folded in her saddlebag. When she opened the door, Noah stood in the hallway, hat in hand, looking freshly washed and slightly uncomfortable in the confined space of the boarding house. He had shaved, she noticed, the strong line of his jaw now visible without the trail stubble that had covered it for the past days. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said, taking in her sleep-flushed cheeks and hastily arranged hair. "It's fine," Josephine assured him. "I didn't mean to sleep so long." An awkward silence fell between them, so different from the easy companionship they had developed on the trail. "I've stabled the horses at the livery," Noah finally said, "and I spoke with the station master. There's a train leaving for Albuquerque tomorrow at 7. From there, you can connect to the line that runs to Denver." "Oh," Josephine replied, the reality of her imminent departure settling around her like a heavy cloak. "That's good." Noah nodded, his blue eyes studying her face as if memorizing it. "I thought we might get your ticket now, then perhaps have supper at the hotel restaurant. It's a step up from trail beans, at least." The idea of sharing a proper meal with Noah, sitting across from him at a table rather than beside a campfire, brought a flutter of anticipation to Josephine's stomach. "I'd like that," she said softly. They walked to the train station side by side, close but not touching, both acutely aware of the propriety expected in town that hadn't seemed important out on the trail. Josephine was conscious of curious glances from passers-by. A woman, in a slightly too large dress, walking with a man who was clearly a working cowboy, rather than a town gentleman, raised eyebrows, even in a frontier town like Tucson. At the station, Noah insisted on paying for her ticket despite Josephine's protests. "Consider it a loan if your pride demands it," he said with a touch of impatience. "You can send the money to me once you're settled in Denver." Josephine wanted to argue further but recognized the stubborn set of his jaw. "Very well," she conceded. "A loan." With the tickets secured in her reticule, they made their way to the Grand Hotel, the finest establishment in Tucson according to Noah. The dining room was elegant by frontier standards, with white tablecloths and a pianist playing softly in the corner. Several diners looked up as they entered, their gazes lingering on the unusual pair. They made Josephine in her simple calico, and Noah in his trail-worn clothes. "Perhaps this isn't the best idea," Josephine murmured, suddenly self-conscious about their appearance. Noah's jaw tightened as he noticed the stares. "We have as much right to be here as anyone," he said firmly, placing his hand lightly at the small of her back to guide her to a table. The gentle pressure of his touch sent warmth spreading through Josephine, momentarily distracting her from the curious onlookers. Once they were seated, a waiter approached, his expression neutral but his eyes appraising as he handed them menus. "May I bring you something to drink while you decide, sir, madam?" "Coffee for me," Noah replied. "Josephine." "The same, please," she said, grateful for Noah's steady presence across the table. As the waiter departed, Noah's expression softened. "I'm sorry if this makes you uncomfortable. I thought you might enjoy a proper meal before your journey." "It's not that," Josephine assured him, touched by his consideration. "It's just, I'm not dressed for such a place." Noah's gaze traveled over her face, his blue eyes warm with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You look beautiful," he said simply, the words clearly not practiced or calculated but spoken straight from the heart. Josephine felt her cheeks warm with pleasure at the unexpected compliment. "Thank you," she murmured, dropping her gaze to the menu to hide the sudden sheen of tears that threatened. How strange that this straightforward cowboy could make her feel more valued with a few honest words than Harold Wilkes had with all his expensive gifts and cold compliments. They ordered steaks with all the trimmings, and as they waited for their food, the conversation flowed more easily, returning to the comfortable rhythm they had established on the trail. Noah told her more about his ranch, his plans to expand his small herd, and the improvements he hoped to make to the cabin. "It needs a proper kitchen," he said, cutting into his steak when their food arrived. "And maybe a room or two added on. It was fine for a bachelor, but—" He trailed off, a flush creeping up his neck. "But," Josephine prompted, curious about his sudden discomfort. Noah shrugged, focusing on his plate. "A man doesn't stay a bachelor forever, not out here. Land needs a family to make it truly productive." The implication that he was considering marriage someday sent a sharp pang through Josephine's chest, a feeling that was dangerously close to jealousy. The thought of another woman cooking in Noah's kitchen, sharing his life and his bed, was unexpectedly painful. "What about you?" Noah asked, changing the subject. "What will you do in Denver?" Grateful for the shift in focus, Josephine considered the question. "My aunt runs a millinery shop. She's offered to teach me the business." She smiled slightly. "I've always had a knack for design. Perhaps I'll become a businesswoman in my own right someday." Noah nodded, his expression approving. "You'd be good at it. You've got a clear head and determination, important qualities for success in any venture." His confidence in her abilities warmed Josephine more than the rich food or the coffee that followed their meal. By the time they finished eating, the dining room had nearly emptied, the hour growing late. "I should get you back to Mrs. Flores's," Noah said as they stepped out into the cooling night air. "You have an early start tomorrow." The reminder of their impending separation cast a shadow over the pleasant evening they had shared. They walked slowly back to the boarding house, neither seeming eager for the night to end. At the front gate they paused, the moment of farewell upon them. "Noah," Josephine began, then faltered, unsure how to express the tumult of emotions she was feeling. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. "It's been my honor to help you, Josephine." "It's been more than help," she insisted, finding her voice. "You've shown me kindness when I needed it most, respect when others have treated me as property, and—" She hesitated, then continued more softly, "friendship when I was most alone." Noah's face was in shadow, making his expression difficult to read, but his voice was rough with emotion when he spoke. "You deserve all that and more." They stood in silence for a long moment, the night air heavy with unspoken words and feelings neither was ready to acknowledge. "Will you come to the station tomorrow?" Josephine finally asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. Noah nodded. "I'll be there to see you off." Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by a renewed sense of loss. One more meeting, one more chance to see his face, and then he would be a memory, a brief, bright chapter in the story of her life. "Good night, then," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good night, Josephine," he replied, and for a moment she thought he might reach for her hand or even draw her close. Instead, he tipped his hat and stepped back, the proper distance between them restored. Josephine watched him walk away, his tall figure soon swallowed by the darkness of the street. Only when he had disappeared completely did she turn and enter the boarding house, her heart heavy with the weight of all that might have been under different circumstances. Morning came too soon, the sky still streaked with pink and gold as Josephine dressed in a new outfit. Mrs. Flores had helped her purchase the previous afternoon a simple traveling dress of gray wool that fit her properly, along with a matching bonnet and gloves. The clothing had depleted most of the money she had brought with her, but Josephine considered it a necessary expense. She couldn't arrive in Denver looking like a vagrant if she hoped to make a fresh start. Mrs. Flores provided a light breakfast and insisted on accompanying Josephine to the station, chattering cheerfully about the weather and the latest town gossip as they walked. Josephine was grateful for the older woman's presence and conversation, which prevented her from dwelling too much on the impending farewell that awaited her. The platform was bustling with activity when they arrived, passengers boarding, porters loading luggage, and the great iron locomotive hissing steam as it prepared for departure. Josephine scanned the crowd anxiously, searching for a familiar tall figure in a worn hat. "He'll be here," Mrs. Flores said quietly, patting Josephine's arm. "Noah Callahan is a man of his word." Just as the final boarding call sounded, Josephine spotted him pushing through the crowd, his expression tense until his eyes found her. Relief visibly washed over his features as he approached, something clutched in his hand. "I thought I might miss you," he said, slightly breathless as he reached them. "I wouldn't have left without saying goodbye," Josephine assured him, drinking in the sight of him tall and strong in the morning light, his blue eyes more vivid than she remembered. Mrs. Flores tactfully moved a few steps away, giving them a moment of privacy amid the bustle of the station. "I have something for you," Noah said, holding out what appeared to be a small leather pouch. "It's not much, but I thought you might need it." Josephine accepted the gift, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. Opening the drawstring, she tipped the contents into her palm, a small stack of bills and several coins, more money than she had expected. "Noah, I can't accept this," she protested, looking up at him in surprise. "You can and you will," he replied firmly. "Consider it an investment in your future millinery business. You can pay me back with interest when you're a successful businesswoman." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to Josephine's eyes. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." Noah's expression softened, and he reached out to brush a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Live the life you choose, Josephine. That's all the thanks I need." The train whistle blew, signaling the imminent departure. "You should board," Noah said, his hand dropping reluctantly from her face. Josephine nodded, suddenly unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She turned to say goodbye to Mrs. Flores, who embraced her warmly. "God go with you, child," the older woman said, then added in a whisper, "Remember what I said about Noah. He is one of the good ones." With a final nod, Mrs. Flores stepped back, leaving Josephine facing Noah once more. "Well," she said, attempting a smile, "this is goodbye, then." Noah's jaw worked as if he were struggling with words he couldn't quite form. "Take care of yourself, Josephine," he finally said, his voice rough. She nodded, turned toward the train, then stopped. Something was wrong, a heaviness in her chest, a certainty that she was making a terrible mistake. She looked back at Noah, standing tall and solid on the platform, his blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. In that moment, with perfect clarity, Josephine realized that she was once again running from one future toward another without considering what she truly wanted. She had been so focused on escaping Harold Wilkes that she hadn't stopped to consider where her heart was leading her. And her heart, she now knew with absolute certainty, was leading her toward Noah Callahan. "I can't go," she said, the words tumbling out before she could reconsider. Noah's expression froze in disbelief. "What? I can't go to Denver," Josephine repeated, stronger now. "Not yet, not without." "Without what?" Noah asked, taking a step closer. "Without knowing if there might be something between us," she finished, her heart pounding with the boldness of her declaration. "Something worth staying for." For a long moment, Noah simply stared at her, and Josephine felt her confidence begin to falter. Had she misread everything? Was the connection she felt merely friendship in his eyes? Then, as the train began to move, Noah's face broke into a smile that transformed his features, the dimple appearing in his cheek as his eyes lit with a joy she had never seen there before. "There is," he said, his voice low and certain. "There has been from the moment I saw you running across that field in your wedding dress." Relief and happiness flooded through Josephine, making her light-headed. "Then I'm not getting on that train," she declared. The smile that spread across Noah's face was like the sun breaking through clouds after a storm. Without warning, he closed the distance between them, sweeping her into his arms and lifting her off her feet in an embrace that drew startled looks from passers-by, but that Josephine couldn't bring herself to care about. "Are you sure?" he asked when he set her down, his hand still holding her arms as if afraid she might vanish. "Your aunt, the millinery shop. Denver will still be there if this doesn't work out," Josephine replied, her heart too full to worry about propriety or practicality in that moment. "But I think it will. Work out, I mean." Noah's expression grew serious. "It won't be easy, Josephine. My ranch is small, the work is hard, and Wilkes won't give up easily when he learns where you are." "I'm not afraid of hard work," she assured him. "And as for Harold Wilkes—" She straightened her shoulders, a new determination in her voice. "I won't live my life in fear of him. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Noah's blue eyes searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "Together," he agreed, the word a promise. Mrs. Flores, who had been watching the exchange with barely concealed delight, stepped forward. "Well, if you're staying, we'd best get you two properly married before the gossips have a field day," she declared practically. "I know the minister's wife. We can arrange something simple for tomorrow." Josephine felt her cheeks heat at the older woman's blunt suggestion, but Noah's hand found hers, his calloused fingers intertwining with her smaller ones. "Is that what you want, Josephine?" he asked quietly. "It's fast, I know, but out here. Out here, folks help each other. It's how we survive." Josephine repeated his words from days earlier, a smile playing at her lips. "And yes, it's what I want." Noah's answering smile was all the confirmation she needed that she had made the right choice. As they walked away from the station, hand in hand, Josephine felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in her life, she was choosing her own path, following her heart rather than someone else's expectations. The next day, in Mrs. Flores's parlor, Josephine Armstrong became Mrs. Noah Callahan in a simple ceremony attended only by their hostess, and a few neighbors hastily invited to serve as witnesses. Josephine wore her new gray traveling dress, adorned with a small bouquet of wildflowers Noah had gathered at dawn. He stood tall and proud beside her, cleaned up but still unmistakably a working cowboy in his best shirt and polished boots. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Noah's kiss was gentle but held a promise of passion that made Josephine's heart race with anticipation of the night to come. They left Tucson the following morning, riding side by side toward the small ranch that would now be their home. Josephine had sent a telegram to her aunt in Denver, explaining her change in plans and promising to write with more details soon. She had also, with Noah's encouragement, written to her father, not asking for forgiveness, but informing him of her marriage and expressing hope that someday he might come to understand her choices. The journey back seemed shorter somehow, filled with conversation and laughter and occasional stops where Noah would pull her from her saddle into his arms for kisses that grew increasingly difficult to end. By the time they reached the ranch on the third day, there was a tension between them that had nothing to do with uncertainty and everything to do with the desires they had both been restraining. As they rode into the small valley, Bandit came bounding out to greet them, barking joyfully at their return. Josephine laughed as the dog circled their horses, his entire body wiggling with excitement. "He's happy to see you," Noah observed, dismounting and coming around to help Josephine down from Pepper. "And I'm happy to be here," she replied, meaning it with her whole heart as she looked around at what was now her home. In the golden light of late afternoon, the modest cabin and surrounding land seemed even more appealing than she remembered. There was work to be done. Certainly the garden needed tending, the cabin could use a woman's touch, and she had spotted at least 3 places where fences needed mending. But it was honest work, purposeful work, and she would be doing it alongside a man she had chosen freely. Noah led the horses to the barn to unsaddle and feed them, while Josephine went ahead to the cabin, opening windows to let in the fresh air and taking stock of what would be her domain. It was as neat as she remembered, though clearly the home of a bachelor who valued function over comfort. "It's not much," Noah said from the doorway, watching her assess the space, "but we can make improvements." Josephine turned to him, seeing the uncertainty in his eyes whether she would regret her choice, whether this simple life would be enough after the luxury she had known on her father's ranch. "It's perfect," she said firmly, crossing to him and placing her hands on his chest. "It's ours." The doubt in Noah's expression gave way to a warmth that made her breath catch. Without warning, he swept her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. "What are you doing?" Josephine gasped, though she made no effort to free herself. "Carrying my wife over the threshold," Noah replied with a grin. "Isn't that the tradition?" "We've already been inside," she pointed out, laughing as he kicked the door closed behind them. "Then I'll just have to carry you to bed instead," he murmured, his voice deepening in a way that sent shivers down Josephine's spine. That night, in the quiet of their cabin with only the sounds of the wilderness around them, Josephine discovered the final piece of what marriage should be: a physical connection as profound and meaningful as the emotional bond they had formed on the trail. Noah was gentle yet passionate, his hands and lips teaching her pleasures she had never imagined, his whispered words of love and admiration making her feel more cherished than any diamond or pearl ever could. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Josephine marveled at the strange and wonderful path that had led her here. 4 days of running from her wedding had brought her to a different kind of union, entirely one based on choice and respect, and yes, love. "No regrets?" Noah asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Josephine propped herself up to look at him, taking in the strong lines of his face now relaxed in contentment, the blue eyes that had captured her heart from that first moment on the dusty plain. "None," she assured him, pressing a kiss to the corner of his mouth. "Except perhaps that I didn't run away sooner." Noah's arms tightened around her, pulling her close against his side. "You ran at exactly the right time," he murmured into her hair. "Straight toward me." In the years that followed, that moment would stand in Josephine's memory as the true beginning of her life, not the day she fled her wedding, not even the day she married Noah, but that quiet acknowledgement that some things, even in the wild and unpredictable West, happened exactly as they were meant to. The small ranch flourished under their joint care. Noah's herd grew steadily, and Josephine, applying the business acumen she had developed helping her father, kept meticulous records and suggested improvements that increased their profits. She also started a small side business making and selling hats to the ladies in nearby settlements, using skills she had learned from her mother and designs of her own creation. Their cabin expanded room by room, first a proper kitchen that was Josephine's pride and joy, then a separate bedroom, and finally, 3 years after their marriage, a nursery for their son, William, named after Noah's father. Harold Wilkes had indeed come looking for Josephine, arriving at their ranch 6 months after their wedding with 3 men and a face dark with fury. But Noah had been prepared, and so had Josephine. They stood together on their porch, Noah with his rifle ready but not raised, Josephine at his side, her head high and her voice steady as she informed her former fiancé that she was legally married and he had no claim on her. Whether it was the determination in her eyes, the silent support of neighbors who had happened to be visiting that day, or simply the recognition that pursuing the matter would bring more trouble than it was worth, Harold Wilkes had eventually turned away, his threats empty in the face of the life Josephine had chosen for herself. 2 years later, they received word that Wilkes had died in a stampede, a fitting end, many said, for a man who had driven his cattle and his men too hard for too long. By the time their daughter Sarah joined the family, named for Noah's sister, Josephine's father had finally relented and come to visit, his anger mellowed by time and perhaps by loneliness. The reconciliation was tentative at first, but the sight of his grandchildren and the evident happiness of his daughter gradually softened the old rancher's heart. "You were right," he admitted gruffly one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Noah teach little William to rope a fence post. "About what marriage should be. Your mother and I had that once before." He had trailed off, unable to speak of the loss that had hardened him. Josephine had taken his hand then, offering forgiveness without words, understanding that grief could make a person forget what mattered most in life. 10 years to the day after Josephine had fled her wedding, she and Noah stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching their 3 children, William, Sarah, and the youngest, James, playing in the yard with Bandit's puppies. The ranch had prospered beyond their modest hopes, with a herd of quality cattle, several fine horses, and a reputation for fair dealing that brought buyers from as far as California. "Any regrets?" Noah asked, echoing the question he had posed on their wedding night, his arm around her waist and his blue eyes as bright as ever despite the lines that a decade of sun and wind had etched around them. Josephine leaned into his embrace, her heart full as she surveyed all they had built together. "Not a single one," she replied, turning to press a kiss to his lips, still thrilling at the way he responded to her touch even after all these years. As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Josephine reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from a desperate bride fleeing an unwanted future to a woman who had found her own path, her own strength, and her own love. She had run from one man toward another, from constraint toward freedom, from fear toward hope. And in doing so, she had discovered that sometimes the bravest choice a person could make was not to run away, but to run toward the life they truly desired, even when that life was nothing like what they had been raised to expect. Noah's arms tightened around her as if he could read her thoughts, and perhaps he could, after so many years together. "I'm glad you ran toward me," he murmured against her hair. "So am I," Josephine replied, turning in his embrace to face the man who had caught her when she fell and helped her find her way. "It was the best run of my life."